So, what do you do when you are in the process of going through your Columbo tactics and you find yourself on the defensive? You find yourself with the other person taking the driver's seat, and they are trying to manage things, and your back is against the wall, and you need to regain the balance in the discussion that is taking place. Well, I submit to you the professor's ploy. We've talked about the Columbo tactic. Now we're going to talk about the professor's ploy. The professor's ploy is where you have a professor, or anyone for that matter, who comes along and basically says, oh, you're one of those Christians. Well, you won't be after I get through with you. And, professors and their like are individuals who very much like to use a bully pulpit and take pot shots at Christians every chance they get. And they'll tell you, the Bible is just a bunch of fairy tales. It's just a bunch of fables. It's no different than the Rosetta Stone or the Gilgamesh epic or anything from the Odyssey or Euclid or on and on and on and on. And what happens when they make statements like that is well-meaning Christians get their dander up. That's what my grandma used to say. Don't get your dander up. Well, they get their dander up. I don't know what dander is, by the way. Pets have it. Other than that, I don't know what dander is. But you get your dander up, okay? And evidently that's not a good thing. And what happens is you become on the defensive, and it's almost like you're going to draw your sword and have an attempt a head-to-head duel with the professor. Do not make that mistake. Do not make that mistake. It is right-hearted, but it is wrong-headed. It is an approach that very rarely works because it violates the very first rule of engagement, right? We remember this. We've talked about this. Never make a frontal assault on a superior force in an entrenched position. That professor is a superior force unless you really know your stuff and you're good at debating. And what they will try and do, or people like that, what they will try and do is they will try and draw you into a defensive posture. And then what's happened is you've put yourself in a corner and your back's against the wall. Put it another way. The guy with the microphone usually wins. Okay? We see all of these things that are posted, Ben Shapiro debates, Tucker debates, some of these other guys from PragerU and whatnot, and it looks like every time they win the debate. Part of that is because of the fact that they're the person up front and they're the person that has the volume. So, it's almost like trying to race against an incumbent. The incumbent political person has the advantage because they are the incumbent. They're already in the place. They're already in the seat. They've got the home field advantage. Same thing is true with the professor and things of that nature. So there is a better way. The professor knows they have that strategic advantage, and it's foolish to get into a power struggle. So do not engage. Do not engage. Instead, use your tactics. Raise your hand and ask a question. And you might ask that question it's a Columbo question, but you're going to ask that question in a different manner. You might raise your hand and say something like, "Professor, can you give us a little more detail on that, of what you mean? What kind of fable are you talking about? You say that Christianity and the Bible is nothing but a bunch of fables. Can you give us a little more insight on how you arrived at that?" What does that do? That puts it back on them. They're the ones that have to proof up. When you're talking about fables, what do you mean by that? Professor, question, do you believe that there's nothing in the biblical documents that has any historical value? You're saying that everything is a fanciful invention of some sort. What is your opinion in this? You're putting it back on this person who has tried to bait you and tried to draw you in. And these are all creative variations of the Columbo question. What do you mean by that? So let the professor explain themselves and listen very carefully to the response and ask more clarification questions if need be. And if they falter, if they stammer in any way, you know what? Other people will pick up on that. Other people will pick up on that, and if they have trouble making their ideas clear, it will become very obvious without you really saying anything that they're not thinking very carefully about their challenge. So when you're satisfied, you have a clear take on that view and what that view is, then ask them, how did you come to those conclusions? See, all you're doing is you're asking questions. And in the process of asking questions, you're seemingly seeking knowledge. But what you're really doing is you are having the attack back and forth, but you're doing it in a nice way. You've taken the high ground. And it makes that teacher or that other person shoulder the burden of proof for their assertion, for their statement. It forces them to explain the line of evidence that they have of how they arrived at that. And it could be very interesting. It could very well be that, when they were younger, they had a bad experience with the church, or some tragedy happened, and they became bewildered, and God didn't, follow through for them, and so therefore I'm going to say that I don't believe in God. God is a fallacy, and on and on and on. It could be that all they're doing is aping what their professor taught them. But the truth is, if they have really and truly studied all of the information, they will have to come to the same conclusion that you have. And they won't be able to say that, oh, well, it's just a fairy tale. So again, where are they getting that from? How did they come to that conclusion? All right, the professor says, I'm a fair man. You must be one of those fundamentalist Christians. You think that the Bible is inspired Word of God, every jot and every tittle. We have a little extra time. Why don't you stand up and explain to the rest of the group why you think the Bible is not a bunch of fables, but rather the infallible Word of God? Go ahead. The time is yours. Don't take the bait. Do not take the bait. Think for a moment about what he has just done. In one quick move, he has cleverly shifted the burden of proof from himself to you. And the truth is, you have not made a claim. You've not made a claim. He is the one that is advancing a view by saying the Bible is a fairy tale. So it is up to him to defend it. He is the teacher after all. If you fall into the trap of taking the bait, it's going to be fatal. Because the professor is trying to get you to do his job. So what you need to do in a case like that is politely shift the burden back where it belongs, on the person who made the claim. You might say something like, well, Professor, you don't know what my view is. I haven't really said what my view is. You don't know whether or not I might even be agreeing with you. It doesn't really matter what I believe. Your ideas are the ideas that are on the table here, not mine. All I'm doing is asking for some clarification and wondering whether you have good reasons for what you have stated. Boom. Mic drop. And if they give you an answer, well, thank them for the answer and move on, and you have saved yourself from a dangerous situation, so to speak. The professor's ploy is an attempt that anyone makes to shift the burden of proof for their claim onto somebody else. Don't fall for it. Don't fall for it. And in many cases, it's the professor demanding students defend their views that they have not even expressed, when he is sidestepping his responsibility to defend the statement that he has just made. Do not be afraid to question someone just because they are a professor or a person that supposedly is supposed to know more. Challenge them. Challenge them on your terms, not on their terms. And of course, gracefully, respectfully, tactfully. We don't have to be experts on every subject. We don't. We can ask questions. And in asking those questions, it reveals so many things about whether or not they're believing a fallacy and promoting some rhetoric that they've heard, and so they're just repeating, or whether or not they have actually studied a particular subject and they have a valid opinion. When someone says, you proved me wrong, don't play that game. Well, I'm not here to prove you wrong. I'm simply asking a question from the standpoint of, you made this statement, and I'm asking you to further support that statement. What background do you have, and what proofs do you have, and what research have you done for you to be able to say that the statement that you just made is valid? And they may try again. Don't fall for it. Go right back to it. Well, it's not about me. You're the one that made the statement. This is called getting out of the hot seat. Getting out of the hot seat. We have to be persuasive to discover that we are facing a superior challenger that we may not be equipped to handle. And you ever heard of Aikido? Okay, it's a form of karate, right? You ever done Aikido, Max? No? Oh. It's a form of karate where you are using the force of the other person's energy to your advantage. They come at you, and instead of you defending them, you grab them and draw them to you. And one of these things, just like that. Okay, right? Slow-mo. And here's how it works to get out of the hot seat. A person, you feel overmatched in a situation and overwhelmed in a conversation, and you immediately shift from persuasion mode to fact-finding mode. You don't argue your case. You use your questions, and you become a student, or at least you appear to become a student of the other person's view, asking for clarification and for reasons. And when you respond this way, it does a couple of things. First of all, it buys you some valuable time, because now the other person is blithering. And they're trying to sound intelligent. It also shows that you are not afraid of the other person, and that you are interested in learning more about their view. But when it's all said and done, and they have given you their statement or their reasoning, here's how you end it. Here's how you get out of the bad spot. You can say, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that information. I'm going to think about this for a while, and we'll talk again. And it's done. You've closed it down. Those words, "now let me think about it," are like magic, because once you say them, you free yourself from any obligation to respond further at that moment. Let me think about that. I'll get back to you. Now who's in the driver's seat? You are, of course. You're a relaxed and listening person. You are not a challenger. And you have graciously, deftly turned the tables. And you have sidestepped a challenge that you cannot answer, and you have diffused the confrontation, and the pressure is off, but yet you are still engaged in all of this. Very useful approach. Instead of trying to resist the force of another person's attack, you have stepped aside and you've let them have the floor. And unbeknownst to them, you have put the burden of proof back on them. So, a lot of people you talk to struggle when you turn the tables and you ask them to give you evidence for their claims. Because again, they haven't thought it through that far. The majority of people have not thought through what they say. They're just saying it because it sounds good. It made a good sound bite. They read it somewhere. It's a mantra that they've heard somebody else say, and so they're passing it on. But they have not thought it through. And you are asking them to give evidence for their claims, and you're using questions to expose their bad thinking. And avoiding your questions may be their only recourse. They may try to change the subject even, or reassert in other ways. And what happens when you're in a debate or a conversation with someone, and and they're losing. What happens? It gets personal. You're just a narrow-minded, fundamental bigot. A misogynistic, Anglo-Saxon, blah, 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 blah. Yes. Okay. I can't win logically, so I'm going to insult you and think that I'm winning by insulting you when what I'm really doing is only showing my own level of ignorance. So when it gets personal and when you feel attacked, what you do in that case is what we call you narrate the discussion. Narrate the discussion. Take a minute to step outside of the conversation and describe the turn of the discussion that has just happened. And it will help the other person see how they've gotten off course. And you can say something like this: I want you to notice the turn that our conversation just took. First, you made a fairly controversial statement here. And I asked you simply a couple of questions about it, and so far you haven't been able to answer them. Instead, what you've done is you've taken off in another direction, and you've decided to attack me. But before we move on to a new topic, would it be okay if we finish the old one first? Because I am really interested in what your response is. Boy, you've brought it right back. I mean, don't do the tit for tat thing. You're a narrow fundamentalist bigot. Oh yeah, well you're a liberal. I mean, you know, all is lost in that case. No, let it bounce off. Who cares what they call you? You know? They basically called Jesus spawn of Satan. So it can't be any worse than that. Again, step out of it, summarize it, narrate it. We began talking about this. You made this statement. I asked you a couple of questions to clarify that, and your response was to do thus and so. Now, before we move on to a different topic, would you like to go back and finish what we were talking about? Because you still haven't answered my question. Make sense? Sometimes there's a completely different problem. Sometimes the person that you're talking with may not be interested in truth at all. Instead, they're maneuvering to score an intellectual jousting match, especially if they have an audience. Especially if they have an audience. They substitute slick rhetoric and subtle distractions for intelligent points. And if you're alert, you might catch that and call them on it. But again, when someone's cherished viewpoint is at stake, it is not unusual for people to raise empty protests. Have you seen any of the interviews that people have done with some of these protesters? They don't even know why they're protesting. They don't even know why they're protesting. Couldn't tell you. Objections that sound worthwhile but simply can't be defended once they stop and think about it. Again, narrating the situation exposes that there is a whole lack of substance behind all the bluster. And that's what we have to keep in mind. So again, we're developing these tactics to be able to use in different conversations with people. And our number one ace in the hole is the Columbo tactic, right? Could you explain what you mean by that? I have a question. Could you explain what you mean by that? Let me see if I understand what you're saying, right? And on it goes. Avoiding the professor's ploy is a very, very important thing. We're going to talk more in the weeks ahead about Columbo, because there are more things with Columbo. There's Tactic 3 and Tactic 4. Ooh. You might want to go home and watch some old Columbo shows just to, get your appetite whet on some of these things. All right? All right, we're dismissed.